Hello and welcome to Folktales and Fantasy, the podcast where we talk all things fantasy and more. My name is Cameron Michaels, and welcome to the third episode of this podcast. This is the third and final episode that will be free on YouTube. The rest of the episodes will be available on iTunes with little snippets available also on YouTube, just to give you a little tease. And if you're interested in supporting these three episodes, these episodes will also be on iTunes. So if you feel generous, go ahead and check those out in the description below, if I did in fact remember to put them there. Okay, this episode we're going to talk about world building, since this is a topic that I feel is pretty important to fantasy. As someone who now reads, listens, watches, and basically spends most of his entertainment free time anyway, on fantasy, even not free time, writing fantasy now, as I'm trying to publish a novel, which is crazy to think about. World building is a very key aspect of this genre, and sci-fi and fantasy. World building, and when I mean world building, for those of you that are not acquainted with the term, world building is essentially really just what it sounds like. It is the author, the storyteller in question, fleshing out their world, the setting that the audience is placed in, to the point where it feels believable. And these stories I have here today, I feel do that well, really well, in execution. And if you thought last episode was a doubleheader with How to Train Your Dragon, we have a triple header today. So before we get into that, we are going to start with a graphic novel, and then we'll get into the triple header in question, which is the adaptation. Actually, we'll do the adaptation last. The book, audiobook, and adaptation. And yes, it is one that you guys will know pretty well if you know anything about fantasy. But first, we're going to go to the graphic novel. Batman Year One by Frank Miller, David Mazzucchelli, I hope I'm saying that right, and Richmond Lewis. This is a graphic novel that for years and years and years I have heard praise heaped onto this story as being essentially an origin story for Batman, and really just the setting of Gotham as a whole, which is really what I wanted to focus on, because Batman as a character we've seen established a lot throughout the years, whether that's movies or books. In many ways, we have seen, especially in films, we have seen, and even in TV, we have seen Bruce Wayne become Batman so many times that if you don't know the story of how Bruce Wayne becomes Batman, you have been living under a rock. And even the way they execute it here in Batman Year One, which is in itself a unique take that, to its specifics, has not, I feel, been nailed anywhere, except for maybe Batman Begins comes close. But there are just some moments in this story that make Batman as a threat to the criminals of Gotham City really intimidating, and just really interesting how Batman works in the early stages, which is a part of why I'm excited for the new Batman film, because it seems like it's more of a Batman Year 2, which, while not the same as this, will also incorporate ideas of, his early stages of being Batman. Excuse me, I need to adjust in my seat here. I really need to change up my setting of my recording stuff. I'm a bit scrunched in here and my butt hurts. But the world building in this graphic novel. Now this, to my recollection is not like the other graphic novels I've talked about, Planet Hulk and World War Hulk, where they took a bunch of comic book issues and then combined the arcs together and sold it as a graphic novel. I believe this was planned from start to be a graphic novel and was sold as a graphic novel. And when talking about the world building for this story, that would be Gotham City. And I've never felt, this is going to sound cheesy as all heck, but I don't care. Gotham City has never felt more real, more fleshed out. Not flushed out, fleshed out. It's not flushed out, it's fleshed out. You're not flushing a toilet. You're fleshing out a story. It has never felt so fleshed out than it has in this graphic novel. And I think a big part of that is because it doesn't really focus on any of the comic booky villains that in Batman's Rogues Gallery, except for maybe Catwoman. But Catwoman is kind of more of a anti-hero, sometimes a hero, sometimes a villain, also love interested. It goes back and forth. But in this story, it really just focuses on the mob, the crime bosses within Gotham City. It also focuses a lot on Jim Gordon. A lot of this story is focused on Jim Gordon and him being new to the police force and how corrupt it is there. And I don't want to go too deep into what happens in this story regarding that, but it gets quite interesting. Also, I feel like I should make a disclaimer for those of you who, I don't know the age group at this time of who is watching my podcast, but a lot of these stories that I've talked about, especially Batman Year One goes into more adult topics. So just a forewarning for that. I don't know if that's really necessary, because again, I don't know who my audience is as of yet. As of recording this, I haven't released a single episode of this podcast, so we'll see. But just a disclosure, this goes into adult topics, specifically around Commissioner Gordon. But that's really all I'll say about that. Commissioner Gordon really is what, for me, he is the character. The best way, I see this used a lot in stories. A good way to establish a world with your audience is have one of your key characters be new to the setting that you're introducing. And then that character who is new, he has to experience all these new things for himself. And as a result, you, the reader or listener, whichever, also gets to experience it from this character's eyes. Now, to be fair, that isn't always the best way to do it in stories. I know that, again, it all comes down to execution. Sometimes there are stories like Malazan. I haven't read Malazan, but I know as far as its world building goes, it just kind of goes, go, just go, here we go. There's no real setup of the world, at least at the beginning. It just kind of starts. At least that's what I've heard. Maybe I'm wrong. But there are several approaches to world building, and there's not necessarily a wrong one. It is based on your execution. You can even take a bad way of establishing world building and turn it initially at first glance like, oh, this doesn't seem right, and you can execute it well. My first reaction to hearing that Malazan didn't have starting world building from a new experience, I was like, oh, well, I don't really want to read that then. But then I've heard so much rave positive things about Malazan and the way it ends that I was like, oh, well, then I have to read it. So I bought the first book, and I will be getting to that at some point. Definitely want to give Malazan Book of the Fallen a read for sure after I get through all the other stuff that I want to get to. Commissioner Gordon is the one who sells you on the ground level of what Gotham City is, because he's new to Gotham City. So in that way, you're able to experience this world from his eyes. And then after Batman, Bruce Wayne, is all trained up and he starts to go further into attacking these crime bosses, you get to see the insides of what these crime bosses are actually like, what the mob is actually like through Batman's eyes, because he's new at being Batman. It's a really interesting way to set up, and that's why I say that Gotham is more realized here than it is anywhere else, because from both of the most important characters in the story, they're both new, so it's doubly effective because it's executed well in both ways. So in that way, I feel like I'm repeating myself over and over again, but I just need to stress that with both characters from those two sides, from both the ground level and then the crime scene area, and then those two steadily converging, really is a smooth transition to how this world is set up in the reader's mind. And you don't even notice that stuff when you're reading. This is me just over analyzing a story that somebody created, that this all goes into like the creation process, but when it's there on the page, you're just like, cool artwork, sweet story, and it's Batman, so it's awesome, which it is. And if you see it for just that face value, that's fine. That's what the author intended you to see, what he intended you to feel. But all of that emotion it starts with world building. Setting up a story it begins with world building, and then how your character builds from that, or how your story surrounds the world, that is how stories are made. And that's why world building is so important, and that's why it's so important to Batman Year One. So overall, I would say, compared to I've read a lot of graphic novels, but compared to all the Batman, I surprisingly haven't read a ton of Batman stuff, which is a crying shame. But I would say this is one of my top Batman graphic novels. I don't think I like it as much as I read Volume 1 and maybe I think it was just Volume 1. Volume 1 of Batman Year 50, New 52. Oh, that's what I read. Volume 1 of Batman New 52, and then I read Volume 1 of the Detective Comics, where Batman basically creates his own good version of the Suicide Squad, which is actually pretty sweet. But my favorite graphic novel, I don't even know if this counts as a graphic novel since it's a compilation of issues, but the Court of Owls storyline, oh my gosh. I love the Court of Owls. Maybe I'll get to that one day. I technically don't own it, but my brother does, so maybe I'll ask him and we'll talk about the Court of Owls one day. But Batman Year One, I would say, is probably my second or third favorite Batman graphic novel. If it's not above Detective Comics Volume 1, it's just next to it. Yeah, I'll say that. It's tied for second place with Detective Comics Volume 1. That's where I'll leave that. All right. And that was just the warm-up, you guys. We have a triple feature today. We're going to talk about The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. The audiobook and the book and the trilogy adaptation. We are talking about all three. The reason I didn't talk about all three How to Train Your Dragon movies the last episode was because I only talked about the first book, so I'm only talking about the first movie. The Hobbit, there's only one book. And all three movies were based on the story of the one book. So it would not make any sense to not talk about all three movies with the one book. And I have both read the physical book and listened to the unabridged audiobook narrated by Rob Inglis, the same guy who I have been listening to the narration for The Lord of the Rings. And I apologize if some of my thoughts on the narration of The Lord of the Rings get a bit muddled with my thoughts of The Hobbit and how J.R.R. Tolkien sets up his world, because it's been a while since I revisited The Hobbit. I would say this has been the first time I've gone back to The Hobbit in maybe a year or two, maybe more. But the story itself is still very fresh in my mind, and his writing style is extremely fresh in my mind, because I was literally listening to The Return of the King all day today while I was at work, which is fantastic. But the tone of The Hobbit versus The Lord of the Rings is vastly different. The Hobbit is a lot more whimsical and adventurous, I would say. And in that sense, it is more about... The Hobbit is a lot more... Well, I don't know. There are 3 books for The Lord of the Rings to set up its world. But as far as Tolkien's writing style is very, very, very focused on building its world. And a part of that is, for Christmas, my parents got me, I believe it was my parents, got me a 2nd edition hardcover of The Silmarillion, which I am going to read and talk about one day for this podcast, because, oh my gosh, that is probably my favorite physical copy of any book that I own. It is gorgeous. But upon reading some letters and things written in the foreword by Christopher Tolkien, his son, I can see that Tolkien's ideas around the Silmarillion, which is basically the tale of the beginnings of Middle-earth and the world and how it came to be and stuff like that, those ideas and notes had been jotted down and written down from the conception of Middle-earth. The Silmarillion has always been a part of these stories, but it took his son to turn it into a narrative of sorts. And if I'm incorrect in that assumption, then feel free to correct me by DMing me or emailing me. Whatever. I'm probably wrong about a lot of things. So it goes without saying that Tolkien would have an emphasis on his world building if he put so much emphasis into something like the Silmarillion being so closely tied to all of his other works. You can see he is so genius. Tolkien is a madman and a genius for how much he interweaves things from one story to the next. And I haven't even read the Silmarillion yet. I'm pretty sure it's going to interweave even more once I read that book, which I'm pumped to read. Seriously. I don't think I've ever been so excited to read this book than I have after I got the gorgeous 2nd edition that I got. I could gush about that all day, but we're talking about The Hobbit here. In this book alone, and The Hobbit is just, I feel like, yes, this was the first book he published. This book is just a taste, just a side dish compared to what is to come. And we'll talk about The Lord of the Rings one day, very soon, actually. It is just a taste of what is to come, and I mean that in world building as well. The characters are as iconic as you know them from the films. Gandalf is amazing. I love Gandalf. Bilbo is witty and charismatic and lazy, and he's a hobbit, and he's hilarious, and I love him. And he's just as hilarious and amazing when he's old in The Lord of the Rings. I love Bilbo Baggins as a character, and while something I've noticed is when the films came out, other than the common complaint of, there are 3 movies and there's only 1 book, which we'll get to, a big complaint was a lot of the dwarves don't get their own character development as, separate characters because there are so many of them. That is kind of in the books as well. Yeah, I think that's a not controversial statement to say, though I'm going to be saying some controversial things coming forward. But it kind of is true. A lot of the character development is focused around Bilbo Baggins, going from this uptight person who doesn't really want to go on an adventure to, unlike the movies, he is forced by Gandalf to going on this adventure. When the dwarves leave, and yes, okay, spoiler warning for The Hobbit. Right now, I am going to be talking about spoilers for the book, for the audiobook, which are the same thing, because it's unabridged, and the films. I am going to be talking about the films and book. So spoilers for a book that came out however long ago, and spoilers for films that have also been out for a long time. So if you stick around, it's your own fault. In the books, Bilbo is basically forced to leave the Shire and go on this adventure with the dwarves. And not like in the movie, where in the movie and the book, the dwarves just kind of show up at his home out of nowhere. But at the end, when the dwarves leave, Bilbo in the books is like, oh, yay, they're gone. I'll just enjoy some food. And then Gandalf bursts in and is like, what are you doing? We're all waiting for you. Come on. And just kind of leads him out the door. In the movie, Bilbo sees they're gone and is kind of sad that they're gone. And he's like, no, I'm going on my adventure. It's a subtle thing, but it really does emphasize that in the book, he's a lot more uptight. But I would argue there are other ways that the movie shows that he's just as uptight and really doesn't really want to go on an adventure. Like when they're leaving and he's on the pony and he's like, we have to turn around. I forgot my handkerchief. Like, oh my gosh, suck it up, Bilbo. You're such a hobbit. You're such a hobbit. But yeah, Tolkien has a big emphasis on world building. Aren't you surprised? The guy who created his own languages for the species in his world is obsessed with world building. Who would have guessed it? No, he's very good at it too. When he describes it, I always am like, amazing. Tell me more. I want to know more about this place. And he's really good at description about other places. Something I've noticed is the way everyone talks. I know this book was written in a much later time than now. I don't have the current date for when this book was written right in front of me. I kind of wish I did now. But everyone speaks so respectfully in The Hobbit and even in The Lord of the Rings. Everyone speaks so respectfully. Like, I can't even describe it. Even if people are at odds with each other, oftentimes they still talk to each other as like using words like master or using their full names. Like, it's just so respectful. And I'm like, man, a part of me wishes we talked like that. A lot of today's speech is sarcastic, which, I mean, can't lie. I would miss that if we didn't talk sarcastically. Like 90% of my voice is sarcasm, so I would miss that. But everyone talks so a specific way, which really adds to, the flow of how this world works. And then, okay, one thing that is super intriguing about this story is the idea of goblins and orcs and all of these different creatures, both the good and evil, like elves and stuff. They each get their own languages, some more fleshed out than others. But one thing, we're going to go into the nitty-gritty now. One thing that a lot of people complain about, if you couldn't tell, I am a big fan of the films. And I know that's a controversial thing to say because a lot of people don't like the films, and I kind of understand that. I kind of do. A little bit. Just a little bit. I have more things to say in defense of the movies than against them. Though there are definitely some things you can nitpick, that's for sure. But a big thing that I notice is the third book, people not the third book, the third movie. When everyone talks about the third movie, everyone is always like, oh, they showed none of this stuff was how it was in the book. The Fifth Army wasn't, the last two armies weren't orcs, they were goblins. It was goblins and wogs in the books. First of all, in the books, I actually thought this was kind of ridiculous to call it Battle of the Five Armies in the book because, and again, I'm sorry if I make you upset, not my intention. I'm just sharing my personal thoughts as I read this book. In the book, the Battle of the Five Armies is elves, dwarves, humans, goblins, and wogs. Wogs are just like these big, terrifying wolf thingies. It's hard to explain unless you see them for yourself. But the goblins, I'm pretty sure, aren't they riding the wogs? Aren't they just riding wogs? Have wogs ever been shown to be intelligent creatures? Why do they get their own army? Like, I feel like it's just a way so we can say it's the Battle of the Five Armies, but maybe I'm totally off the mark there. Maybe I am. I probably am, because in the movie it's just an army of an army of orcs, and then another army of orcs, which honestly I think makes more sense because you have an army going in to distract, and then another army is going in to destroy. Kind of like how in, Return of the King, when all the orcs are attacking Minas Tirith, and then the other army of people was supposed to come in from the ships and attack with another army. It's two separate armies, right? Am I crazy? Isn't that how it works? Just because they're the same species doesn't necessarily mean, or if they're on the same side, doesn't necessarily mean it's the same army, right? Am I crazy? Am I losing my mind? And here's another thing. While we're on the topic of species and culture and world building, people complain that they use orcs in the final battle instead of goblins. The word orc, I don't think is ever used in the book of The Hobbit, except for the blade Orcrist, which by the goblins is just called, what is it called? The beater? I think it's just called beater. Or the goblin cleaver. Kind of interesting how the goblin cleaver is called Orcrist. And then let's turn our attention a little bit to the Lord of the Rings, shall we? The Lord of the Rings uses the term goblin and orc interchangeably whenever the word is used. The word orc is more so used. Here's what I think happened. So essentially, goblins are either a type of orc, or orcs and goblins are just the same thing in the books, in the story, and then as time has gone on, as people create their own stories, they've made goblins and orcs separate creatures. Don't think that's how it was in the book. At least, that's not how I've interpreted it. Again, I could be totally wrong about this, but I feel a bit justified in saying this, in defending this part of the films, because I feel like it's kind of a petty thing to bog down if that is an interchangeable thing that was meant. I don't think J.R.R. Tolkien maybe he hadn't come up with using the word orc, or maybe it didn't fit the tone of the book as much as it did The Lord of the Rings, because The Lord of the Rings, the tone is way different from The Hobbit. They are vastly different. I know you can technically put these 4 books together as one series, but The Hobbit, as a prelude to The Lord of the Rings, has a very different tone. It's much more of a adventure. When you think of the word adventure in The Hobbit, you think of, it's a whimsical, magical adventure. A quest. That's a good way of saying it. It's not like that in The Lord of the Rings. In The Hobbit, it is an adventure. I'm going on an adventure. They even say that in the film. But I want to turn my attention to the audiobook for a second, because this is another thing that I feel people might have mixed feelings about. There's just mixed feelings all over the place with The Hobbit. Rob Inglis, I feel, is a solid narrator. And maybe that's just biased talking. But to me, he does a good job. This is what I think is good. From what I've heard of good narrators like Adam Stubbs from The Heart of Stone, who is currently my favorite, what a good narrator is good at, should be good at anyway, is making you buy the story that he's reading. You know, he actually sounds like he's enjoying what he's reading. He feels compelled to keep going. And while I could see some people making the argument that his voices for some things is not great, I could definitely... This is what took me the longest to get used to, was his interpretation of some of the songs and poems in the book. And this also goes for The Lord of the Rings as well, because it doesn't always match the style that he's singing. Like, if you go listen to the Misty Mountains song that they sing in the films, you know, far over, that is, oh my gosh, every time I have watched those movies so many times with my family and by myself, and it gives me chills every time I listen to it. It's that good. When you listen to it, Rob Inglis do it, he puts a more of a cheery note to it, and it doesn't really fit it that well. And that kind of happens with some of the songs. Some of the songs he does an interpretation of I have definitely been like, yeah, okay, I dig this. But that might also just be me getting used to what he's doing as you go along. And that's what I would say. A lot of people complain, both the books and the audiobook. People complain about Tolkien's inclusion of songs and poetry. That, for some, takes them out of the story. While I can see that argument being made for the narration, like I just said, Rob Inglis's interpretation, his way of singing, it's not his voice. It's not his singing voice. That's not what I'm complaining about here. Or nitpicking, because it really is just a nitpick. I'm talking more about the certain style or tone he might go for some of the songs. Not all of the songs. Again, some of these that he sings, I actually get into and I quite enjoy and quite liked. But for the most part, especially for the book, just reading the book, I actually quite enjoy it, because it adds more to the culture of Middle-earth. For me, anyway. I can see people not liking it, and it will bother you more if you don't like it. It'll bother you more in the audiobook, because you can't just skip over it while you're reading. You have to sit there and listen to it. So I can understand that. But if you just power through it, or even if you just listen to what is being said, it's very interesting what is being told. These stories and these myths. You know, I think we take myths in fantasy for granted a little bit, because we in modern day have created our own myths and stories and folktales that we have just accepted as norm. For example, Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny. Stories of Santa Claus and Easter Bunny, sure, they might have originated from factual things, especially Santa Claus. I'm not so sure about the Easter Bunny. But they're folktales. They're stories that we tell. Santa Claus will come down your chimney and bring you these presents, and then he'll leave. Or The Great Pumpkin, though that's a much more obscure one, but if you know what I'm talking about, you are a human of culture. But I just find it interesting that he chose to include that. I know it's not something everyone will enjoy, but I certainly did, because it adds to... it richens Middle-earth, I feel. I don't know what it is, but I just love learning more about Tolkien. I feel like I'm sitting on the ground and I'm listening to a master tell me his experiences through life when he tells these stories. And it's just, I would have loved to sit down and have a conversation with Tolkien and just have him explain his reasonings for certain things. That would have been something I would have loved to do. That, and I'm sure many people who love fantasy, especially writers, would have loved to sit down with him and talk with him. Now, one thing, speaking of modern writers, I am sure a lot of people are going to mention this, so I'm just going to mention it here and right now. This is classic fantasy, and what I mean by that is a lot of modern fantasy nowadays uses a specific way of a singular person point of view. And usually what that is, the narration will most times in modern fantasy and in sci-fi and other books as well, will focus on a specific character's point of view, what they're thinking in their head. And this is from third person as well. What they're thinking, what's going on inside their head to develop that specific character. And then if it jumps to another character's thought, there will be a section break or a chapter break or something like that. There will be a clear emphasis that, okay, we're moving to another character. Not in classic fantasy. In classic fantasy, especially in Tolkien's work, we have what is called an omniscient point of view, where the author in question, and here we're talking about Tolkien, can basically bounce to whoever's mind they want and talk about whoever they can include anyone's thoughts that they want at whatever time possible. They can just, boom, they're at another point now. We can switch and include other things. And I'm not saying that's bad. I'm really not. But I could see it being jarring for some people who are used to reading modern fantasy. If you're not used to reading classic fantasy, it could be a bit jarring for when you read or listen to The Hobbit. But once you get used to it, you're in. At least I was, because his writing style is very much emphasized on world building over pretty much everything else. And that's not to downplay the other aspects of the story. His character development with Bilbo Baggins especially, that is really where the character development is, and his relationship with the dwarves, Thorin Oakenshield in particular, which is emphasized further in the films, which I will also get to. But him going from an uptight hobbit to this adventurous, wide-eyed, also still hobbit, but more adventurous and wide-eyed and more curious for what is outside his little hole, if you will. That is where the character aspect lies. And then the story is, they gotta go slay a dragon, and then chaos ensues even after they complete that. The Battle of the Five Armies happens. So I would say, for those of you who are a bit skeptical about reading classic fantasy, you've never read classic fantasy before, you've never read from this point of view, give it a shot. And if you don't want to go through the song breaks, try reading it, because although it is a different writing style than what you're used to, it is a different style of perspective for the audience, it is still a well-written story. This is not a book with these and those. This is not the Bible, New King James translation, okay? This is readable for nowadays. The story told here is timeless, and it will always be timeless as far as I'm concerned. This is very easily readable. I'm just saying that the point of view stuff, the head hopping, is it will take you a bit, just a bit, not much, to get used to. But once you get used to it, you will be sucked into this world, and you will want more. Which is why we have the Silmarillion, which is a prequel, and we have the Lord of the Rings. So if you're interested, go check out the audiobooks by Rob Inglis. I definitely recommend his narration, because although there are some controversies around his voices and maybe his interpretation of songs, he never falters once in how much he has engaged himself into reading this story to the audience, which is very important. Even when he's doing the song things, he just goes with it, and that is what is important. So if you're interested, if you love audiobooks, if you like the convenience of it, go check it out. If not, that's fine. Go check out the books. But before we end here, I want to talk a little bit about the films and the controversy surrounding it. I can understand some people not liking it for various reasons. And ultimately, entertainment is a subjective thing. One of the few things that is subjective in our world is the consumption of entertainment. And in my personal opinion, I think the films get too much of a bad rap. Especially for the changes that they made, because I will defend to the death that a lot of the changes made in the films, not all of them, a lot of the big changes made were made for the better. An example, Azog the Defiler was killed at the beginning in the battle of, in the book, when they go to, what is the place called? The mines of Moria. When they try to retake Moria in the books, Azog is killed there. In the movie, he just gets his hand cut off and he comes back, and he's a major antagonist for the rest of the trilogy. I much prefer that. It gives a face to a lot of the evil before Smaug comes in. He's a very intimidating. I don't know the name of the actor who portrays him, but he did an excellent job portraying the Pale Orc. I love his interpretation of this character. He's both foreboding and terrifying and tactical, as we see in the third book. Again, I already touched on the thing about the orcs versus goblins. They're essentially the same thing. I don't have a problem with that at all. I also don't have a problem of the wogs being their own army, because I don't really see the point in that. I like the ties in with, they went more in depth with a lot of the necromancer stuff, making it more obvious that it is Sauron, and while that is in the book, it's more emphasized here. If you're going to watch the films, though, watch the extended editions, especially the extended edition for the third one, because the third extended edition is leagues better than the original version, and I quite enjoy the original version, but after watching the extended, it's hard for me to go back because of how good it is. Okay? If you're going to watch them, watch the extended editions. They're worth it. I'm serious. The first one, the last two are. They're important. Watch them. The extended editions. Please. For the sake of all that is good in this world, go watch the extended editions. Okay, last complaint. The Battle of the Five Army itself. When we're talking about a lot of the complaints, most of them are thrown in the way of the third movie. And that is because a lot of the battle is not really shown in the books. And a lot of the battle is changed in the film. This is one change that I do not like. In the films, Legolas is the one who takes down Bolg, who is the leader of the orc army that comes the fifth army that comes to the Misty Mountains in the Battle of the Five Armies. Bolg is their leader. In the books, again, Azog doesn't exist. Bolg is just the leading goblin in the battle. In the books, the tide changes when... Goodness, I forget his name. The shapeshifter who turns into a big old bear. That dude is awesome, by the way. I love him. When he shows up, it's explained that when he shows up, the tides of battle change because he defeats Bolg in battle and just wipes out a ton of people. And while in the film, when he shows up and the eagles show up, the tide does change because he's a force to be reckoned with. But it's Legolas who defeats Bolg. And while they set up this conflict between the two, and the fight itself is really cool and really interesting, I would have preferred to have them set up they set up the hatred of this shapeshifter guy. I'm sorry, I forgot his name. Forgive me. They set up the tension between this guy and the orcs. He hates orcs. I would have loved to see him just mow down this orc, because he's just the disgusting freak of nature. I hate him. I would have loved that to be changed, but the battle itself, a lot of people don't like that how the battle itself plays out, and I hard disagree. I think this is the biggest ball that the books drop, and I know I'm going to get a lot of flack for this, but I think the books drop the ball when it comes to the final conflict. I know a lot of people will tell me, oh, but J.R.R. Tolkien's focus was not on the battles themselves, and that may be true for this book. In The Lord of the Rings, and I know I'm talking about The Lord of the Rings a lot, Helm's Deep, the Battle of Helm's Deep, and the Battle at Minas Tirith, I just got through the Battle of Minas Tirith today. Oh my gosh, the way those battles are described is masterful. Those battles are some of my favorite battles in fantasy in book form. Not the movies. The movies did an excellent job with those battles. Well done adapting that, because that wasn't an easy task. But the books themselves, the way they were adapted, was just masterful. And after seeing the way Helm's Deep and the Battle of Minas Tirith were so well written, it proves that Tolkien knows how to write action and conflict. He's a master at it. He's amazing at writing these big battles. So I just can't help but look back at the Battle of Five Armies, and Bilbo gets hit in the head. As soon as the eagles fly over, he gets hit with a rock, and then he wakes up and the battle is over. And then he's explained how they won the battle at the end. He's explained how the shapeshifter came in, defeated Bolg, and the battle was won. I would have preferred to have seen that over told it. You know, show, don't tell. That's a key thing. And again, if you disagree with me on that, that's fine. I still adore the Hobbit book. I still adore it. But I am not, because there are other aspects where it does so much right. This is like the one thing that I don't like about the books. And while it is a glaring thing, everything else just outweighs it immensely. Still love the Hobbit book. But I just feel like he could have done so much more with it. And we see that potential, I would argue, fulfilled in the movies. And I know a lot of people are going to argue, and I've seen people online, people who were quote-unquote close to Tolkien, who say that, or were close to Tolkien, I have no idea, say that the films were not focused on action, so I don't like the adaptations. This is even pointed at the Lord of the Rings adaptations in some cases, because they were just turned into action films. The vision of Tolkien is still very much present in these adaptations. The world building is still present. The cultures are still present. The languages are still present. That's all still there. And if you read The Lord of the Rings, and even at parts of The Hobbit, you can see the action is so well written by Tolkien. And I don't agree. I don't agree with what he did with the end of The Hobbit, and I much prefer the way the films did it, but that is just me. And before I shoot myself in my own foot again, we're going to wrap that up here, guys. This is the third and final episode that will be free on YouTube. Again, the rest of it will be up on iTunes, and clips of it will be available on Instagram and here on YouTube. Links to these episodes on iTunes will be in the description if you guys feel like supporting me. I have an Instagram, Cameron IG Michaels. I know I only said Cameron IG in the last episode. I apologize for that. My Instagram is Cameron IG Michaels. You guys can, if you are interested in having me look at something, feel free to follow me, or if you'd like, maybe DM me on Instagram. That will also be in the description, as well as my email if you're interested in sending me an email to ask me about something that you'd like me to look at, a book, audiobook, graphic novel, anime, sci-fi, whatever. Let me know. Email me at folktalespod@gmail.com. That's folktales, no space, pod @gmail.com. And I will catch you guys next time. I have something special planned for the next 3 episodes, so look forward to that. See you guys later.